A 17-month-old boy endured over 50 injuries in just 8 months. Yet the system meant to protect him failed at every turn, leaving him to suffer in silence until his tiny body could take no more. Welcome to Global Shadows, where we uncover the darkest crimes against the innocent. Today, we're diving into the tragic story of Peter Connelly, better known as Baby P, a toddler from Tottenham, North London, whose brutal death in 2007 sent shockwaves around the world, exposing not just the cruelty of his abusers, but the devastating cracks in the child protection system. Peter was tortured by the very people who should have loved him most: his mother, Tracey Connelly, her sadistic boyfriend Stephen Barker, and Barker's brother Jason Owen, who turned a small, cluttered home into a chamber of horrors. Despite being on Haringey Council's Child Protection Register and receiving 60 visits from social workers, doctors, and police over those 8 months, Peter's cries for help went unheard, drowned out by bureaucracy and missed opportunities. On August 3rd, 2007, he was found dead in his cot, his tiny body broken, fractured ribs, a broken back, missing fingernails, and a tooth swallowed after a vicious punch to the face, injuries so severe they shocked even seasoned investigators. Tracey, Stephen, and Jason were convicted of causing or allowing Peter's death, with Barker also later found guilty of raping a 2-year-old girl on the same child protection register, revealing a pattern of depravity that went unchecked. The case didn't just expose the inhumanity of Peter's killers. It revealed a catastrophic failure of Haringey's child protection services, the same authority criticized 7 years earlier for the death of Victoria Climby, another child failed by the system. Social workers were vilified, with some sacked amid a media frenzy led by outlets like The Sun, while politicians like Ed Balls and David Cameron turned the tragedy into a political football, pointing fingers instead of fixing the broken system. But beyond the headlines, Peter's story raises haunting questions that linger to this day. How could so many professionals miss the signs of his suffering? Why did the system prioritize keeping families together over his safety, even when the danger was clear? And what can we learn to ensure no child endures such horror again? Join us as we step into Tottenham, where a little boy's life was stolen and a community's trust in its protectors was shattered, leaving a legacy of grief and a desperate call for change. What's the most shocking detail you've heard about Baby P's case so far? Share in the comments. Peter Connelly was born on March 1st, 2006, to Tracey Connelly, a 25-year-old mother of 4 in Tottenham, North London, a working-class area marked by deprivation and struggle. Tracey's own childhood was marred by neglect. She'd been placed on Islington's child protection register at age 10, raised by a mother battling alcohol addiction, a cycle of dysfunction that would later echo in her own parenting. At 16, Tracey met Peter's father, a man 17 years her senior, with whom she had a volatile relationship that crumbled shortly after Peter's birth, leaving her a single mother juggling 4 children under 5. By November 2006, she began dating Stephen Barker, a man with sinister past. Along with his brother Jason Owen, Barker had a history of cruelty, including a 1996 assault on their own grandmother, forcing her to sign over her home, and a childhood incident where they tortured animals, skinning frogs alive, acts that hinted at their capacity for violence. Barker moved into Tracey's chaotic home at 60, Penzance Road, a flea-infested dump reeking of dog urine, where Peter and his 3 older siblings lived in squalor, surrounded by filth, broken toys, and barking dogs that roamed freely. The first signs of abuse appeared in December 2006, when Peter was just 9 months old, a chubby, blue-eyed baby who loved to smile despite his circumstances. A GP noticed bruises on his face, chest, and legs during a routine checkup, prompting Tracey's arrest on suspicion of assault and Peter's temporary placement with a family friend, a move meant to keep him safe while social services investigated. Despite this alarming red flag, he was returned to Tracey's care in January 2007, with social workers believing she was committed to improving after she attended parenting classes and promised to end her relationship with Barker, a promise she never kept. Over the next few months, Peter's injuries escalated. Bruises on his arms, black eyes, swelling on his head, leading to hospital visits, and another arrest of Tracey in May 2007 for suspected child cruelty. Yet each time, the system failed to act decisively, swayed by Tracey's excuses that Peter was clumsy or had fallen. Haringey Council's legal advice claimed the threshold for care proceedings wasn't met. A decision that prioritized family unity over Peter's safety, a choice that would prove fatal as the abuse continued to worsen. How could a child so visibly at risk, with documented injuries and a mother with a history of neglect, slip through the cracks of a system designed to protect him? Did you know Peter was returned to his mother despite clear signs of abuse? What would you have done differently? By June 2007, Peter's situation grew even more dangerous, descending into a nightmare cruelty that no child should ever endure. Stephen Barker's brother, Jason Owen, moved into Tracey's home at 60, Penzance Road with his 15-year-old girlfriend and 3 children, turning an already chaotic household into a breeding ground for violence and neglect. Peter, now 15 months old, was subjected to sadistic, unrelenting abuse that left his tiny body covered in marks of torment. Barker trained him like a dog, forcing him to obey commands such as sitting still for hours or fetching items, punishing him with slaps or kicks if he failed to comply, while Tracey watched, complicit in the cruelty, often laughing as Peter cried. Witnesses later reported Peter screaming in terror whenever Barker entered the room, his small frame trembling at the sight of the man who had become his tormentor. Over 8 months, Peter suffered over 50 injuries, fractured ribs from being squeezed, a broken back from being slammed over a knee, mutilated fingertips where his nails were ripped out, and missing fingernails that left his fingers raw and bleeding. On July 30th, 2007, a social worker visited the home but missed the extent of his injuries because Tracey had smeared chocolate on Peter's face to hide fresh bruises, a calculated act of deception that allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. Just 2 days later, on August 1st, a pediatrician from Great Ormond Street Hospital examined Peter after concerns were raised during a health check, but the doctor lacked the expertise to recognize the severity of his condition, missing the fractures and internal injuries that were killing him. The next day, on August 2nd, police informed Tracey she wouldn't be prosecuted due to insufficient evidence, a decision that sealed Peter's fate, emboldening Barker and Owen to unleash their worst violence yet. On August 3rd, 2007, Peter was found dead in his cot, blue and dressed only in a nappy, his body cold to the touch. A post-mortem revealed the horrifying extent of his injuries, including a tooth he'd swallowed after being punched in the face with such force it broke his jaw, a final act of brutality that ended his short life. The abuse had escalated rapidly in those final weeks, with Barker and Owen taking turns inflicting pain while Tracey stood by, later claiming she was unaware of the full extent, a claim that rang hollow given the visible agony Peter endured. How could a mother sacrifice her child for a monster like Barker? And how could those final chances to save Peter be so carelessly squandered? Can you believe Tracey hid Peter's injuries with chocolate? What do you think about her role in this tragedy? Peter's death wasn't just a failure of his caregivers. It was a failure the entire system meant to protect him, a system that crumbled under the weight of its own flaws. Despite 60 visits from social workers, doctors, and police over 8 months, no one acted decisively to save him, each agency passing the buck while Peter suffered. Haringey Council, already under scrutiny for the 2000 death of Victoria Climby, an 8-year-old girl tortured to death under their watch, failed to learn from past mistakes, repeating the same errors that cost another child his life. Social workers didn't know Barker lived in the home, as Tracey hid his presence, claiming he was just a friend who visited occasionally, a lie that went unchallenged despite his belongings scattered around the house. Police investigation stalled. An officer assigned to Peter's case in May 2007 was reassigned to another unit without passing on critical information, leaving his file to gather dust while Peter's injuries worsened. A 2010 serious case review found that every agency involved was incompetent, lacking urgency, and failing to challenge Tracey's poor parenting, often accepting her excuses at face value despite the mounting evidence of abuse. The review also highlighted systemic issues that plagued Haringey: understaffing, soaring caseloads. Social worker Maria Ward's caseload doubled to 50% above the recommended limit of 12 by July 2007, leaving her overwhelmed, and a flawed computer system that hindered communication between agencies, with vital updates about Peter's condition often lost in the shuffle. Haringey's focus on preserving family unity, even in the face of clear danger, left Peter vulnerable, a policy rooted in the belief that children fare better with their biological parents, even when those parents are unfit. Posts on X from 2019 and 2022 reflect public outrage over systemic failures, with users calling the missed opportunities outrageous and questioning how such a tragedy could happen under the watch of so many professionals. One writing, 60 visits and no one saw the truth? That's not failure, that's negligence. The case exposed a broader problem. In deprived areas like Tottenham, where poverty, addiction, and dysfunction are rampant, child protection services are often overstretched, underfunded, and ill-equipped to handle the volume of at-risk children, leaving the most vulnerable to fend for themselves. How can we trust a system that fails the children who need it most? And what does it take to break this cycle of neglect? What do you think about the systemic failures in Peter's case? Could better communication have saved him? On November 11th, 2008, Tracey Connelly, Stephen Barker, and Jason Owen were convicted at the Old Bailey of causing or allowing Peter's death, a charge that acknowledged their collective responsibility for his suffering, with Tracey pleading guilty to spare herself a harsher sentence. Barker was also found guilty of raping a 2-year-old girl, another child on Haringey's protection register, in a separate trial that exposed his predatory nature, a crime that occurred while Peter was still alive, adding another layer of horror to the case. On May 22, 2009, the sentencing shocked the public. Tracey received an indefinite sentence with a minimum of 5 years. Barker got life with a minimum of 12 years for Peter's death and rape, and Owen was given an indefinite sentence with a minimum of just 3 years, despite his role in the abuse. The relatively short minimum term sparked outrage. Many felt the punishment didn't match the crime's horror, with The Sun running headlines like, "Baby P killers walk free soon," fueling public anger at what seemed like leniency for such monstrous acts. The public and media reaction was explosive, turning Peter's death into a national scandal. The Sun, under editor Rebecca Brooks, launched a Baby P campaign, gathering 1.5 million signatures to demand the sacking of Haringey's social workers and director Sharon Shoesmith, whom they painted as a face of failure. Ed Balls, then children's secretary, publicly dismissed Shoesmith on live TV in December 2008, a move later ruled unlawful by the Court of Appeal in 2011, which found Balls had acted with procedural unfairness under media pressure. Social workers Maria Ward and Gilly Christie were also sacked, though the General Social Care Council found no reason to bar them from practicing, knowing they had followed protocol despite the systemic chaos. Professor Ray Jones, in his book The Story of Baby P, argues the social workers were unfairly scapegoated, noting they were on the job while other agencies like the police, who delayed investigations, and Great Ormond Street Hospital, whose pediatrician missed Peter's fractures, escaped similar scrutiny, a disparity that deepened the injustice. The media frenzy created a Baby P effect, with a surge in child protection referrals as fear gripped the system, social workers terrified of being the next to be named and shamed. Did the media's which hunt distract from the real lessons of Peter's death, or did it force necessary accountability on a failing system? Do you think the media's reaction helped or hurt child protection efforts? What's your take on the sentencing? Peter's death led to sweeping reviews of the UK's child protection system, a desperate attempt to prevent another tragedy like his. 3 inquiries were launched, including a nationwide review by Lord Laming, who had previously investigated Victoria Climbié's death and warned Haringey of its failings, a warning they clearly ignored. A 2010 serious case review concluded Peter's death could and should have been prevented, pointing to failures across social services, police, and health agencies. Social workers missed Barker's presence, police failed to follow up on arrests, and health visitors didn't escalate concerns despite Peter's visible injuries. Haringey Council made immediate changes. By 2010, they reduced reliance on agency social workers from 45% to 20%, increased the number of children in care from 460 to 620, and hired more permanent staff to stabilize their workforce. Nationally, the government pushed for greater transparency, publishing serious case reviews starting in 2010 to ensure lessons were learned, a move that aimed to hold agencies accountable and rebuild public trust. However, the Baby P effect had lasting consequences that rippled through the system for years. Social workers became hypervigilant, fearing blame, which led to a spike in children being taken into care. By 2011, care applications rose by 11%, sometimes unnecessarily, as workers erred on the side of caution to avoid another scandal. Professor Eileen Monroe, in her 2011 review of child protection, noted the system had become over-bureaucratized, prioritizing paperwork over professional discretion, leaving practitioners scarred by the fear of being named, blamed, and shamed, a fear that stifled their ability to make nuanced decisions. Tracey Connelly was released in 2022 after several parole denials, having served 12 years, but was recalled to prison in September 2024 for breaching her license conditions, a move that reignited public debate about her punishment, with many arguing she should never be free. Barker and Owen remain behind bars, their parole bids repeatedly denied, with Barker's additional rape conviction ensuring he'll likely die in prison. Peter's father, who had been separated from Tracey since Peter was an infant, spoke of his guilt and anger in a 2017 interview with The Guardian, saying, "I'll never forgive myself for not fighting harder to see him, and hoping his son's legacy would make children safer." Did the changes go far enough to protect the most vulnerable, or are we still failing children like Peter? Do you think the changes after Peter's death have made a real difference? What more needs to be done? Peter's death left an indelible mark on child protection in the UK and beyond, a tragedy that forced society to confront its failures in protecting the most vulnerable. The case highlighted the devastating cycle of abuse. Tracey herself had been a victim of neglect, placed on a child protection register as a child, a pattern that repeated with her own children, perpetuating a generational trauma that Peter never had a chance to escape. Peter's siblings, including a sister who was raped by Barker while under Haringey's watch, were also let down by the system, their trauma often overlooked in the media storm that focused solely on Peter, leaving their pain unaddressed for years. Social workers, vilified by the press, faced threats and had to relocate. Sharon Shoesmith required a safe room in her home on police advice after receiving death threats, while Maria Ward lived in fear of retribution, her career and mental health in tatters. Yet, as Professor Ray Jones notes in the story of Baby P, other agencies like the Metropolitan Police, who delayed investigations into Tracey's arrest, and Great Ormond Street Hospital, whose pediatrician missed Peter's fractures days before his death, faced far less scrutiny, a disparity that fueled resentment among social workers who felt they were scapegoated for systemic failures. The case also exposed how political and media agendas can distort justice and healing. David Cameron, then opposition leader, in The Sun turned Peter's death into a political weapon, using it to attack labor's social policies, while social workers bore the brunt of public anger, often unfairly. Over a decade later, the Baby P effect lingers. Child protection remains a field gripped by fear, with practitioners hesitant to take risks. A 2022 report from the British Association of Social Workers, noting that 70% of social workers still feel paralyzed by the fear of media backlash. But there's hope. Haringey and other councils have improved training, reduced caseloads, and increased transparency, while advocates like Peter's father continue to push for systemic reform, speaking at child protection conferences to ensure Peter's death wasn't in vain. Peter's father hopes his son's legacy will be a safer future for all children, a sentiment echoed by those who knew the little boy who loved to smile despite his pain, a smile that photos captured even as his body bore the marks of unimaginable cruelty. How can we honor Peter's memory by ensuring no child suffers in silence? And what more must we do to break this cycle of failure? What's the biggest lesson you've taken from Peter's story? How can we honor his memory? Peter Connelly's story is a heartbreaking reminder that the innocents among us can suffer in silence, even under the watch of those meant to protect them, a tragedy that should never be repeated. At just 17 months old, Peter endured unimaginable cruelty in a home that should have been his sanctuary, his tiny body bearing the scars of a system that failed him at every turn. At Global Shadows, we want to honor Peter's memory by sharing lessons to keep your children safe, lessons that could have saved him if only someone had acted sooner. First, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, whether it's a neighbor, a family member, or a situation, act on it immediately. Peter's grandmother noticed his fear of Barker, his trembling whenever the man was near, but didn't speak up fully, perhaps fearing she'd overstep. Don't let fear of being wrong stop you from reporting concerns to authorities, because your voice could be the one that saved a child. Next, know the signs of abuse. Unexplained bruises, fearfulness, or changes in behavior. like Peter's terror around Barker or his sudden withdrawal, are red flags that demand action. If you see them, contact authorities immediately, because time is critical and a child's life may depend on your courage to act. For communities, demand better from child protection systems, because Peter's case showed how understaffing, poor communication, and misguided policies can fail vulnerable children. Support initiatives that fund social services, improve training for social workers, and ensure caseloads are manageable, especially in deprived areas like Tottenham where children are at higher risk. Advocate for policies that prioritize a child's safety over family preservation when there's clear evidence of danger. Peter should have been removed from Tracey's care long before his death, but the system's bias toward keeping families together left him in harm's way. You can also volunteer with local child welfare organizations to help spot at-risk kids early, offering support to families before tragedy strikes. Finally, teach your children to speak up if they feel unsafe, even around familiar adults, and ensure they know they'll be believed, a lesson Peter never had the chance to learn. Peter's voice was never heard. Let's make sure every child's is, so no one else suffers as he did. To Peter's memory, we promise to keep fighting for a world where no child endures such pain, a world where every child is seen, heard, and protected. Subscribe to support us if you like our stories. Share and tell us, how do you ensure the children in your life are safe from hidden dangers? What steps do you take to protect kids in your community? Drop your advice in the comments.